There's a crime so cruel that even heaven couldn't forget it. A story that has crossed generations and still makes the world stop to listen. Get ready, because what you're about to discover will forever change the way you see justice, forgiveness, and redemption. It was an ordinary autumn morning when it all began. The sun was still struggling to break through the heavy clouds covering the small town of Millfield in rural England. The narrow streets were deserted, except for a solitary figure walking hurriedly toward the local police station. Her name was Margaret Holloway, a 62-year-old woman, gray hair tied in a tight bun, trembling hands clutching an old wooden box. Inside that box was a secret she had carried for 40 years. A secret that burned her soul like live coals. A secret that heaven refused to let stay buried. Margaret hadn't slept right in decades. Every night, she saw the same face in her dreams. Blue eyes that stared at her with a mixture of fear and pleading. A child's voice that echoed in her mind like a cracked bell. She tried to pray, tried to ask for forgiveness, tried to convince herself that she was too young to know what she was doing on that fateful day in 1983. But heaven didn't accept excuses, and memory didn't forgive. You're going to discover in this story how a single moment of silence can destroy entire lives. How witnessing evil and doing nothing can be worse than committing the crime itself. And how, decades later, the truth always finds a way to rise back to the surface, no matter how deep you try to bury it. This isn't just a story about guilt. It's about the invisible weight we carry when we choose to look the other way. It's about delayed justice and about souls that never find peace while the truth remains hidden. The first problem began that afternoon in June of 1983. Margaret was only 22 years old and worked as a nanny for the Thornfield family, one of the most respected in Millfield. The house was imposing, with well-kept gardens and an iron fence that separated that world of privilege from the rest of town. Margaret took care of little Emily Thornfield, a 7-year-old girl with golden curls and contagious laughter that lit up any room she entered. Emily was special, not just because she came from a wealthy family, but because she had that rare purity that only truly happy children possess. She drew colorful butterflies, sang made-up songs, and believed the world was made only of good things. That specific afternoon, Margaret was in the garden hanging clothes when she heard screams coming from upstairs. They weren't playful screams. They were screams of pure and absolute terror. Her heart raced. Her hands dropped the sheet she was holding, and she ran toward the house. The stairs seemed endless. Each step echoed like a war drum. When she reached Emily's room, the door was ajar, and what Margaret saw through that crack changed her life forever. Inside the room was Thomas Thornfield, Emily's uncle, the eldest son of the family matriarch. He was 35 years old, always well-dressed, always smiling at social gatherings, always admired as an example of success. But in that moment, Margaret saw the monster hiding beneath the impeccable suit. Emily was huddled in the corner of the room, clothes torn, tears streaming down her face, eyes glazed with shock. Thomas turned slowly when he noticed Margaret's presence. There was no guilt in his gaze, only cold calculation. He walked toward her with measured steps, carefully closed the bedroom door, and said in a low, controlled voice, "If you tell anyone what you saw here, I'll make sure you never get work in any town again. I'll destroy your life and your family's life. No one will believe you. I'm a Thornfield. You're just another replaceable employee." The second problem was even more suffocating than the first. Margaret was young, poor, with no formal education beyond basic schooling. Her mother was sick, needing expensive medicines. Her father had abandoned the family years before. She was the sole breadwinner of the household. Losing that job meant losing everything. And Thomas knew this. He knew every vulnerability of hers like a predator knows the weaknesses of its prey. So Margaret made the choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She chose silence. She chose false security over justice. She chose to protect herself while abandoning Emily to her fate. In the following days, Margaret tried to convince herself that it had been just an isolated incident. That Thomas would never do that again. That Emily would be fine. But every time she looked at the girl and saw those eyes that had lost their sparkle, every time she noticed how Emily now flinched when adults approached, every time she heard her crying softly at night, Margaret felt a piece of her own soul shatter. Emily changed completely. The cheerful girl who sang made-up songs transformed into a silent shadow who walked the halls like a ghost. She stopped drawing. She stopped smiling. She stopped believing the world was made of good things. 3 months later, Emily Thornfield was found lifeless in her room. The official investigation concluded it was suicide, even though the girl was only 7 years old, a child who barely understood the concept of death. The Thornfields used their influence to close the case quickly. No detailed autopsy, no deep investigation, just a discreet burial and silence bought with money and power. Margaret was present at the funeral. She saw the white coffin being lowered into the earth. She saw Emily's mother collapse in tears. She saw Thomas Thornfield standing beside the family, serious face, false tears streaming, playing the part of the devastated uncle with award-winning actor perfection. And Margaret remained silent. She continued carrying the secret like a lead cross on her back. She continued living a lie that poisoned every day of her existence. The climax of this story happened 40 years later, on that cloudy morning when Margaret finally entered the police station with the wooden box in her hands. Inside the box was Emily Thornfield's diary, a diary that the girl had given Margaret weeks before she died, asking her to keep it forever. A diary where Emily, with her childish handwriting and spelling mistakes, had recorded everything. Every abuse, every threat, every cry for help ignored by the adults around her. On the last page, Emily had written in shaky letters, "Nobody listens to me. Nobody protects me. I don't want to be here anymore." Margaret handed the diary to the officer on duty, a young man who hadn't even been born when Emily died. She confessed everything, every detail, every moment of cowardice, every time she chose silence when she should have screamed. The case was reopened immediately. Thomas Thornfield, now 75 years old, a respected retired businessman, was arrested that same week. The investigation revealed that Emily had not been his only victim. Over the decades, at least 8 more children had suffered at his hands. 8 lives destroyed because no one had the courage to speak the truth 40 years earlier. The message of this story is devastating and necessary. Evil thrives in silence. It thrives when ordinary people, good people, frightened people, choose to look the other way because it's more convenient, safer, easier. Margaret Holloway wasn't a monster. She was just a young, scared woman trying to survive in a world that punished the weak and protected the powerful. But her choice had consequences that echoed through decades. Consequences measured in destroyed lives, in stolen childhoods, in murdered innocence. There is a price for silence, and that price is always paid by those who can least afford it. The children, the vulnerable, those who depend on courageous adults to protect them and find no one willing to risk their own comfort in the name of justice. Margaret was prosecuted for complicity and obstruction of justice. At 62 years old, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She accepted the sentence without appeal. She told the judge that no prison would be worse than the prison she had lived in for 40 years, waking up every morning with Emily's face etched in her memory, wondering how many other children could have been saved if she had had the courage to speak. Thomas Thornfield was sentenced to life in prison. He died 2 years later in prison, at 77 years old, never showing remorse. Until his last day, he insisted the accusations were lies from people who wanted to destroy his legacy. Margaret left prison after serving her full sentence. Today, at 65 years old, she dedicates her life to working with victims of child abuse. She travels to schools, communities, organizations, telling her story. She looks into the eyes of teachers, nannies, neighbors, relatives, and says with a firm voice, "If you see something wrong happening to a child, speak up, even if you're afraid, even if it seems impossible, even if it costs everything. Because silence costs more. Silence costs lives." Emily Thornfield's story has become a symbol of a much bigger problem. How many children are suffering in silence right now because the adults around them choose not to see, not to hear, not to act? How many monsters remain free because ordinary people are afraid to risk their job, reputation, security? Heaven refused to forget Emily. And we cannot forget either. We cannot normalize silence in the face of evil. We cannot accept that protecting our own convenience is more important than protecting the defenseless. This story doesn't have a happy ending. Emily will never come back. The 8 children who came after her carry scars that will never fully heal. Margaret carries guilt that no judicial sentence can relieve. But there is a lesson here. A lesson bought at a painfully high price. The lesson is that our humanity is measured not only by what we do, but by what we fail to do when we witness injustice. It's measured by the courage to speak when it would be easier to remain silent, by the willingness to risk comfort in the name of doing what's right, by the absolute refusal to allow evil to prosper without resistance. If you know someone who is suffering, if you suspect a child is in danger, if you see something that your instinct tells you is wrong, don't choose silence. Choose courage. Choose justice. Choose to be the voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Because in the end, we will have to answer not only for the crimes we commit, but for the crimes we witness and do nothing to stop. Heaven doesn't forget. History doesn't forget. And your conscience will never let you forget. Nothing goes unpunished. Not even silence.